Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait a moment as folks are joining us from the waiting room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here today. Good afternoon. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, American Rescue Plan and the Arts. My name is Marissa Shadburn. I'm the Field Education Coordinator with Americans for the Arts. We've got a great program planned today and I'm excited to get started, but first, some quick reminders. Closed captions are available for today's activity. To activate the closed captions, press the CC or closed captions button at the bottom of your screen and then select Show Subtitle. Today's presentation is being recorded and the recording will be available on ArtsU in 1 to 2 business days. An additional recording with closed captions will be available later next week. This session will also be available on the Arts Action Fund Facebook page immediately following today's live stream. Please submit your questions via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you see a question in the Q&A that you would like to know the answer to, please upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up button. Questions with the most votes will be prioritized. Resources for today's session are in the Resources tab of the event page on ArtsU and can also be found on the Arts Action Fund page. To those of you joining us via Facebook live stream, welcome. Please share your questions via the chat on Facebook. And with that, I'm pleased to pass things off to Nina Oslu-Tunjali, the Executive Director of the Americans for the Arts Action Fund. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you, Marissa, and welcome everybody to another Americans for the Arts and Arts Action Fund webinar on COVID-19 federal resources. It's a pleasure to have all of you. We have a lot of information to cover. This is going to be primarily covering the American Rescue Plan as adopted and enacted on March 11th, 2021. Some of the information is adding to programs that were already created through the CARES Act back in April of 2020 with some new twists and turns that you need to know about. It also adds on to information and programs that were created in the Economic Aid Act that was passed on December 27th of 2020, just very recently, I know, but this is a compounding federal program and resource to all of you. So I want to give you an idea of what the agenda is today and how we'll move along throughout the next 90 minutes. After these opening remarks, I'm going to actually go over areas regarding the stimulus checks and pandemic unemployment. And then I'm going to bring on 2 guest speakers, Jay Dick and Mitch Menchaca, to talk about the new state and local block grants and what opportunities are there. There will be a Q&A after each one of these segments. So I will be pulling from a couple of things. The questions that were submitted in advance through our Google form, as well as any new questions. We're going to try to get to as many as possible after each segment. But especially for those who submitted your questions through the Google form, you provided your email addresses, and I can also get back to you afterwards if we didn't get to your specific answer. But you can continue to put Q&A questions here too. So continuing on with the speakers, then we'll have Peter Gordon to give us some information on current pending legislation that's important for some of the programs going on today, as well as future legislation. And then I'll be back and I'll be joined by Nate Bagaha to talk about all the new twists and turns with PPP and the launch of the brand new program on shuttered venue grants, operator grants. And then we'll have a long Q&A for that one, about 15 minutes. And then, because I know a good number of your questions are about that. And then after that, we'll have Rod Joy and Jen Chang. These are the 2 new political appointees as of January 20th that have come on to the National Endowment for the Arts representing the brand new Biden-Harris administration. And they'll talk a little bit about what's going on there. And then if we do have some time left, we'll just have a general Q&A with the speakers that will still be staying on with us. For today's PowerPoint, you are going to see a lot of links and a lot of information. I want you to know that we have already posted this PowerPoint in a few places. One on the ArtsU resource page. Second is on the Arts Action Fund front page. If you just go to the landing page on the home page, you'll see it there. And then Marissa's also going to be adding it to the chat here so that you can see it. And you don't have to worry about copying down some really long links sometimes. So let's go to the next slide and begin with the stimulus checks. So this is the third round of stimulus checks that the federal government is giving out. And this round, the maximum amount that a single tax filer could get is $1,400. And so here's the breakdown of how it's happening. And what you should know is that these checks have already been sent out, some of them through digital deposits into your checking account. Others are going to be mailed. Others are going to be sent debit cards. It's a variety of ways. It'll be consistent with the way that you have filed your taxes. And that's the way, if you want it going directly to your checking account, I've tried a few different ways to do it. If there's a way to just contact the IRS to ask them to do it, and there isn't. It really is based on you doing it on your last tax return of having a checking account on record. So for this go around, 159 million households should be expecting some form of a payment. And as I mentioned, it's $1,400 of your AGI, adjusted gross income. The tax returns have changed in the last few years when the tax forms change. And that's why I want to point out that your AGI is located on line 8B of your 1040 tax return. And if that number that you have on line 8 is $75,000 or less, you will get the full $1,400 if you are a single taxpayer. And it's based on your last filed tax return. So what that means is your tax return's not due until April 15th for the 2020 year. And if you haven't filed it yet, it will be based on your 2019 tax return. So if some of you actually had a good year this year and you think you might be over $75,000 when you complete your 2020 return, but you're under it for 2019, you might want to wait a few weeks, still get it in before the deadline, because then they'll base, and they've already made the calculations actually at this point of who gets how much, and it's based on what the amount was of your tax return and what was filed on March 11th. They were that ready. And the difference this year is that there used to be like up to a $25,000 phase out. So you could go up to $99,900 and you could still get a little bit of money, but it phases out really quickly now. So if you make a maximum of $80,000 on that AGI, you are going to be phased out and you shouldn't expect any money whatsoever. And it's proportionately much less for every $100 more you make over $75,000. The other thing to know is if you're head of household, which means you have someone who you can claim as a dependent on your tax return, and it had to have been claimed on your tax return. So let's say you didn't have a dependent in 2019, but you do in 2020. You want to get that tax return filed pretty quickly. And I'm going to tell you what happens with after the fact information in a minute. So if your head of household person will also only get $1,400, but their AGI, because they have a dependent, can go up to $112,500 and be assured of getting the full amount. And then it phases out at $120. And then if you're a jointly married couple filing that way as a tax return, you can get $2,800. And your maximum AGI is $150,000 and no more than $160,000. Now, what's really great about this time in terms of the stimulus checks that is very different from the previous ones? For instance, dependents were defined as children specifically, and they had to be under the age of 17. If they were 17 years old as of the day of that enactment, they would not get $1,400. Now, the rule is if they're a dependent, they are a dependent, whether it is your grandmother or your college age student, they just have to be qualified living with you to be determined as a dependent. They are not filing their own tax returns. If these people, if regardless of age now, each one of them will get 1,400, not in their name, but in the tax filer's name. So in the mom or dad's name, they'll get it. So, and also there is no maximum on the number of dependents. That's another new thing. If you have 10 kids, you're going to get 1,400 times 10. If they're all filed, if you can claim them all as dependents on your tax return. And for those of you who are living on Social Security and you do not make enough to file a tax return, don't worry, you will still also get the stimulus funds because the IRS will coordinate with the Social Security Administration's data bank to be able to send you those funds, and you will receive them the exact same way you receive the Social Security benefits. So however you have that set up, it will continue there. Let's go to the next slide. So if you haven't gotten your amount of money, or if you're challenging whether you should have gotten more, here's a couple of nice calculators that are going to help you. The one on the left is at kiplinger.com, and you can put in based on the way you filed your taxes on your last tax return. Okay, it's really important that I say it that way. Whether you filed single, married, separately, all those various different categories. And then the next piece is how many dependents that you claimed on your tax return. Not how many do you have at this moment, but how many you claimed on your last filed tax return. And then that third step, you have to go look at that line 8B to see how much you reported to the IRS on your adjusted gross income. But once you get that information, it's pretty simple, and you hit that submit button, and really in 1 second, you get the answer of how much you should be getting in this round. Then you hop over to the right-hand side and you go to the IRS to see when you'll be getting that amount. It's not going to tell you how much. It's not going to confirm how much you're getting, but it is going to tell you when you should be expecting it and in what form. Will it be a physical check? Will it be a direct deposit to your checking account or a debit card of some sort? And that information is fairly simple too. What I would advise is that you match to the T exactly how you put your name in, or your address or your date of birth on your tax return, on your last filed tax return. It has to match when you put in the information now. Otherwise, it's going to give you an error message. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Something else that before I go into jump into earned income, child earned income, I did want to say that this was one of the questions that came up in advance that I saw, so I'm going to answer it now. And that is they didn't get the correct amount for their stimulus amount, or they didn't get at all the $600 from the December stimulus. And there's some kind of error that you want to challenge the IRS with. So the way the IRS has put out guidance on this is that if you did not get the right amount, they have put in a new section inside the 1040 tax return for your 2020 tax return, where you can claim that this is the amount that I received, but this is the amount that I was owed, to show the difference. And they, as long as they agree, you will get, that is the way they want to administer credits back to you to send you a refund for the amount that you should have been paid. And I definitely know people that I've advised on this who needed to do it that way. And they did get the extra money that they were supposed to get for the stimulus in 2020. And they were able to get it through their tax return as a refund. So it really does work, and that is the way the IRS wants to advise how you do it. Okay, so another new thing that is in the American Rescue Plan's enactment is more money for children, for parents to take care of children. Now, this is not dependents. These are strictly for children, and the cutoff is 17 and younger. So actually, I'm sorry, it's 18 and younger in this case. It was 17 younger for dependents on the other one, but it's 18 and younger here. So what it is it increases by $1,000 for the child tax credit for all families who have children under the age of 18. It went from $2,000 to $3,000. And then you get an added bump of another $600 for a total of $3,600 for each child that is under the age of 6. So you can count up the number of kids you have based on their age, and you will get this amount of money for each child. This is effective for the year we are in. This is not retroactive like some other things. So the way that the IRS and the federal government is going to handle it is sometime at the end of June, early July, they are going to start giving you on a monthly basis the amount of what, based on your last tax return, because they have the information of how old your children are and how many kids you have, and they're going to start sending out monthly payments. And so here's how the cutoff works in terms of eligibility. This can really amount to a lot of money. So this is, for those of you with kids, this really will mean something to you. If you're a single taxpayer, you're going to see similar cutoff as you saw with the stimulus check. Here it's less than or equal to $75,000, but instead of phasing out completely at 80, it doesn't phase out until $200,000. If you are head of household, again, starting at $112,500, but it doesn't phase out until $200,000. And then jointly married, as long as your AGI is less than or equal to 150 and it doesn't phase, nothing phases out completely until $400,000. So, you know, if you have 3 kids, let's say, that are under the age of 6, that's $10,800, and that will be set to you. Now, the way they're doing it, as I mentioned, is they're going to set it up for the first, beginning in July, a monthly payment of dividing that amount into 12, giving you a monthly amount from July through December. And then after that, they want you to claim the rest of what you would have gotten for this year in your tax return, in your 2021 tax return, which gives you an incentive to file as fast as possible. This may seem complicated, but what's that's going to happen automatically. You don't have to ask for it, but it's an opportunity to get you the money sooner. Normally, when they give you a tax credit like this for 2021 that we're in, you don't see it until 2022. This is an opportunity to give it to you in real time while the pandemic's happening. Next slide, please. And then the other area that I'm going to cover is pandemic unemployment assistance. So as you know, what the federal government's doing is adding money to what the states are providing. And so what they are doing is adding an extra $300 in federal assistance on top of your state unemployment. They are extending the amount of time that you can as a maximum number of weeks be on unemployment through Labor Day, September 6th. And they're also paying the state portion to the state to allow you to stay on that long. And they're ensuring that gig workers, self-employed people can continue to be considered self-employed if they are out of work and they choose to file for unemployment, that you're allowed. The other big thing that happened is that this is both retroactive and now, and that is the first 10,000, if you were on unemployment in 2020 and if you're still on unemployment in 2021, the first $10,200 of that unemployment money is now not going to be taxable. Not taxable in 2021, begins a new year beginning with 10,200, and then 2020, 10,200. Now here's the difference. Most of your states have taken out the federal unemployment tax, the tax portion of your unemployment. So now you need to get that back. And so what the IRS has put out guidance on is they do not want you to try to make a special request to get that money back. They are going to come up with guidance in the next few weeks on how tax filers can go ahead and request the money to come back to you that you've already paid on taxes. That does not mean you get $10,200. It just means the taxes that you paid on the first $10,200 of unemployment insurance benefits that you received in 2020, you are going to get that portion back. And if you file in 2021, you can ask them to stop taking out the federal portion, at least until it equals about 10,200. The other just important piece to know, I know a lot of gig workers filed for unemployment. I want to remind you that unemployment is not your business income, it is ordinary income. And while that might be at a higher tax rate, what's good about that is it will not count against showing that you still had losses to be able to apply for a second PPP. And we'll get to a little bit more of that in a few minutes. We can go to the next slide. And I think I had laid it out for Q&A, but I actually covered the main question that was asked kind of repeatedly in my presentation. So I'm going to hand over to our next section so we can move on briskly. And let's go ahead to the next slide so I can introduce Jay Dick, who is our Senior Director of State and Local Government Affairs. And he will be joined afterwards by Mitch Menchaca, who is the Executive Director of the Phoenix Arts Commission, to go over a really big opportunity area for state and local block grants. Jay.
Let's try this again. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Someone tell me you can hear me, please.
Jay.
Perfect. Sorry about that. We've done this for a year and we still have problems with our mute. So thanks for being with us today. I'm going to talk about the state and local block grants. This is a huge priority of your mayors, your county officials, and your state officials there. But it also really relates to how you do your work. So Congress appropriated $350 billion with a B to help state, county, city, and tribal governments to do several different things. Provide government services to the extent of reduction in revenue. So over the last year or so, when your county or your city has lost revenue because of COVID, to help put that back into their tax coffers there. Mitigate economic harm from COVID-19. And this is important by addressing its economic effects, including through aid to households, small businesses, nonprofits, and industries such as tourism and hospitality. So again, this is where the arts and culture is going to come into play here. We can certainly get monies from this big pot of money here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, of course, to also make some investments in water, sewage, and broadband being a very important thing. There's another $12 billion for what we're calling the coronavirus capital projects and public land counties. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. The deadline for this is to spend this money is not until December of 2024. So your state and locals have time to spend this. So obviously, you know, we want to make sure that they're spending it at a correct rate and making sure that they are doing it in a way to help people when they do need it. At least 50% of the funds are to be distributed no later than 60 days, 2 months after the enactment of the legislation. So that clock is already ticking, with the remaining of those funds to be distributed no later than 1 year after the first distribution. So it could be up to 50-50 here. States would have to distribute funds to the smaller towns, so towns under 50,000, within 30 days. So that's important to those small towns that might be really struggling and don't have a backup of a budget there. One note though, a town cannot receive more than 75% of its budget from the relief funds as that budget of January 27th. Next slide, please. So let's break down the $350 billion. It provides $195.3 to the states and the District of Columbia. So $25.5 billion is going to be equally divided between each state and DC. So that's $500 million right there. That's kind of the floor. Think of that as the floor of this. $196 billion would be allocated based upon the state's share of unemployed workers over a 3-month period from October through December 2020. So that's how a lot of this money is going to be distributed. So the federal government's going to look at that unemployed workers in your state for that 3-month period and make those allotments there. And then another $1.15 billion is going to go to the District of Columbia, as they are not a state, to help make them whole with this access to. Another 130 billion is going to go to local governments. So 65 to counties, and this is going to be based on a modified community development block grant formula or their population, which is just average greater. 45.5 billion, or I'm sorry, 45.6 billion for metropolitan cities, again, using a modified CDBG formula, and then 19.5 billion for towns with fewer than 50,000 people, again, based on population, and this will go through your state. Keep in mind with the CARES Act, direct funding to cities and counties, you had to have at least 500,000 people to get direct funding. Now the cutoff is 50,000, so there's a big difference there. And then another 4.5 billion to towns, 20 billion to tribal governments, 10 to this coronavirus capital project fund. That's related to programs to help people get to work, get continuing education, health monitoring, things like that in response to COVID. And then 2 billion for another local assistance and tribal consistency funds. This is to counties, for example, who have lots of federal land and they don't have a lot of population. Next slide, please. Americans for the Arts has created a Google Doc that I encourage you to go look at that lists all the CARES Act. So first round of funding, how much cities and counties and states provided to the people to help with the arts and culture there. So go take a look at that. And if you see that your state, your county, your city is not there, go ahead and add it in at the very bottom there, and we'll make sure that we add it in. Then we're going to be doing, of course, another one for the Recovery Act here as we go forward. Next slide, please. So what is people going to expect to receive? And so we have another great link to our partner, the National Association of Counties, and they have came up with a good idea. This is not 100% of how much each city, each county, and how much each state should be expected to receive from the American Rescue Plan. So take a look at Alaska, one of our least populated states. $187 million would go to those. And then you go down to, say, California, our most populous state, $8 billion would be provided there. Go across, you can look at counties there. So you go by your state and then you can look up some counties there. So I'm from Iowa, so I went to Iowa to look. And, you know, these are some very small counties. So, for example, Adams County receiving almost $700,000. They only have a population of $3,600 people. So you can still see small counties are still going to get a decent amount of money for them. Black Hawk, that has a population of 131,000, and they're going to get 25 million. So go take a look and see how much you're going to get there. And then next slide. Lastly, just want to point out, this is a chart from governing.com, something that's a really great resource to go look at. This is comparing the CARES Act versus the Recovery Act. The CARES Act is those little red buttons, and the Recovery is the blue ones there, to show where the changes in spending is going to happen. So I just want to point out, small business support is going to go from 32% of the funds are now going to go to 47. So they're going to be certainly increasing those funds that are available for small businesses. Nonprofits, 20 to 25. Again, another great increase. Housing rental, again, 14 to 31. So you're going to see a lot more of those. Whereas, like, say at the top, the PPP purchases and stuff like that are decreasing because we have more of our vaccine. So there's a lot of great things going on. Please go check out our website. And if you have any questions, certainly let me know. And I'm going to switch it over to Mitch Menchaca at the Phoenix Office of Arts and Culture to give you some great examples of how your city or county can take advantage of these funds. So Mitch, turn it over to you.
Great. Well, good afternoon, and I'm excited to be here to share the City of Phoenix's story, which may be the story from your municipality, or if you are trying to get American Rescue Plan money from your city, it may light some ideas for you. So in early May of 2020, the Phoenix City Council approved using $2.6 million in federal coronavirus relief funding to help artists, along with nonprofit arts and cultural organizations hurting financially because of the health pandemic. My office administered a program that offered relief grants to artists as well as arts workers, emergency relief grants to the nonprofit arts and culture sector, and then used some money for professional development and technical assistance programs. But none of this wouldn't have happened if we hadn't acted immediately when the pandemic first hit, which is a year ago, almost today. we started working with our constituents as well as our cultural facility partners on sharing resources about what the coronavirus was. Then when the 2-week lockdown was imminent, we distributed information and resources on safety precautions, messaging, and words of inspiration. But when it was clear at the end of March 2020 that we wouldn't be reopening, my team and I jumped into action with constituents, creating Zoom forums, sending out materials we were finding to put a list together on our website. We also started working with partners across the state to discuss amplifying our relief work, and then joined collaborations between our State Arts Commission, Community Foundation, my counterpart in Tucson, and our artist service organization in Phoenix, to pool funds together for an early emergency relief fund, even before we knew about CARES Act. At the same time, we were working within our own annual grants process, working with organizations on their applications and trying to pivot from the standard artistic questions and community engagement questions to learning about how they were faring at that point with the 6-week closure, and to tell us their thoughts about the health of their organizations moving forward. We were also working with current grantees on lifting restrictions from project grants and just releasing checks, even if grant conditions hadn't been met, to just get money out the door. And all of this pre-work is really important because in April, I was invited by the city manager to create a proposal for the coronavirus relief funds because of the work we had been doing with our arts organizations, with the emergency relief fund, with our partners. And they saw that we were already working with our community. It wasn't clear if arts and culture fit into the coronavirus relief fund, but as Jay mentioned, there was support for small businesses, nonprofit support, and we made the case that our arts and cultural nonprofits were small businesses, artists were micro businesses and entrepreneurs, and should definitely be included in there. So I submitted a $2 million proposal, again, on top of our annual grants program that would give relief to organizations, and then money to pay back that statewide emergency relief fund that funded statewide artists, but a big chunk in Phoenix, so that way our repayment could reopen those funds for more artists across the state. Its approval did not happen overnight. It took a lot of internal advocacy at City Hall to share information and facts and figures that I knew nationally and locally. Thank you to Americans for the Arts for their immediate research on the pandemic, as well as our Citizens for the Arts group, because along with our grant application information, we could build the case. We also had to engage grassroots advocacy with our advisory commission. We have a friends group and other community stakeholders to be at the ready to comment on the relief funding when it was presented to City Council. I was able and fortunate to present at a policy meeting of our council and brought a constituent along to show that I wasn't just making an ask for self-serving money from my department, but that there was a need and somebody to back up what I was sharing with the facts and figures. And an exciting moment in that meeting, a city council member, an arts champion city council member said, "Is $2 million what I needed?" Because this was the moment to speak up. And I said, you know, we could always do more with more money. And if we wanted to do more artist support, then obviously more money was necessary. And I left that policy meeting with a vote with $2.6 million. So $600,000 more than what I was going in. And again, to create relief grants for individual artists, emergency relief for the nonprofit art sector. And then again, professional development and technical assistance programs that would help nonprofit arts and cultural organizations and individual artists navigate financial futures moving forward into the new normal. I think we've done about 20 workshops, online workshops since October about artist, business, and legal expertise, fundraising workshops, how to navigate the public art commissions to just really get that information out into the community. And because of that, we have been invited to think about a plan with the New American Rescue money that we obviously want to create direct funds for organizations and artists, but we also now want to take the creative industries into our fold. The for-profit sector, venues, galleries, other kinds of creative industries we're left to apply for other small business programs outside of the city. And what I noticed was that they were actually receiving some smaller funding than our nonprofit organizations. And so I want to find a way to bring them into our fold with this money, but again, want to make sure that there's money for workforce development and continued technical assistance and professional development programs. We are lucky in Phoenix to have an arts-friendly mayor and council and city leadership, but the lessons I learned, if you are continuing the work or just starting this work, is that you can't do it alone. Partnerships are necessary. You have to act quickly. The last CARES Act, until it was extended, we had to get that money out the door by December 31st, 2020. We got our final approval in May, and we did. We got $2.6 million out in the timeline. It was a struggle for us, but we did it. And the third thing I learned is if you don't ask for what you need, you won't get it. So it's all a rosy picture a year later, but we are just really thankful for our city leadership in that, and hope that we can tap the local block grants for even bigger impact in our community recovery.
Thank you, Mitch. And Jay, if you could come on for a moment. As I understand it, many state arts councils also benefited from state block grants that were given to them. Can you just give us a couple of highlights about that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of states out there that did receive state arts agencies that received money from either just directly through the NEA through that pass through, they were able to re-grant out to local arts agencies. Some of them just did it with their normal re-granting process, and others created special programs to help focus on COVID. So,
but more specifically, is the state block grants that came from the CARES Act. Some of that money that's separate and apart from the NEA money, they were able to tap some of the state CARES Act from their governor that were able to be re-granted.
Absolutely. So on the that Google document that you can refer to from the web from the PowerPoint here, you see about 27 states have received through their state blocks grants under the CARES money that their state government has specifically said is for the arts and culture, that then has went down through either their state arts agency or down to the local arts agencies. And it goes anywhere from I think 50 million in Oregon. So anyone from Oregon, congratulations on there, down to several $100,000 dollars from some of the smaller states. So all over the map, but it just shows what great advocacy can do.
Yeah, and then Mitch, a question for you is the 2.6 million that you got from your local city's CARES Act block grant. What percentage of the entire amount of block grant that the city received was that?
I will do some quick math here. It's probably about 1.5% of the total amount.
But that's a reasonable thing for people to understand, that while that's a lot of money for the arts, it's small percentage of the total block grant. So be aggressive and ask for the funds. And because they can't, they have 3 years to spend it in, it might be a multiple year ask that you're asking for. So keep that in mind, everyone, as well as you do the planning. The key is, I think Jay already mentioned it, the money is going out to the states within 60 days of March 11th. And the states have to give it to the smallest cities within 30 days. So they're going to have a bundle of money that they need a purpose for. And you want to put yourself in one of those purposes. Thank you. There might be more questions if we have time at the very end, but I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Before I introduce Peter, I just want to clean something up on the tax return date. Yesterday, the IRS announced that they are extending the date only for federal returns. Please keep this in mind, to May 17th. That was just announced yesterday. But what you need to know is that there are 42 states in the District of Columbia that are not extending the deadline to May 17th. You still have to do your tax return by April 15th for those states. Many states build on your 1040 tax return as the vehicle to complete your state tax return. So you might have to do an amendment to your state return this year to delay putting it in. You have to put in that amendment request if that's what you plan on doing. You cannot do it automatically. So I don't know how helpful it is that the federal government extended it by a month, but there you go. It's until May 17th. For most of you, you probably are going to still have to do it by April 15th. So you have that 1040 to build off of. Okay, I'd like to now introduce Peter Gordon. If he can come online here with his video, he is going to give us an update on some pending and future legislation, some of it literally breaking news. Peter.
Hey, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, well, thank you, Nina. Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick update on what's going on around the Paycheck Protection Program extension. That was passed on Tuesday by the House in an incredibly overwhelmingly bipartisan vote of 415 to 3. This is something that is incredibly bipartisan and Congress wants to move. What this would do is it would push back the date to apply for the loans from March 31st, which is in a couple weeks until May 31st, and also give the Small Business Administration another month to process any claims that were made during that time. And this is incredibly helpful, as Nina and I will talk about a little bit later, but with the Shuttered Venue grant program, and with that new clarification now, nonprofits that have been waiting to know if they could apply for PPP or Shuttered Venue grant can now apply for both. And this gives all those nonprofits an extra couple months to do that. This is moving into the Senate, where the prospects are a little bit more unsure. Again, it's a bipartisan issue, but there are some senators, some Republican senators that wanted to change the language in this measure because they were upset at some of the guidance that SBA gave. But about 20 minutes ago, Chuck Schumer, who's the majority leader for the Democrats, filed cloture on the bill. So it looks like that they will be debating the House passed bill and hopefully passing it at some point next week, which would then give it to President Biden to sign it into law. So it looks like next week we should have that extension passed. Regarding fiscal year 2022 appropriations, this is something that has should have been started this process, but given the new administration, given the complications over the transition, as well as the insurrection and the impeachment that happened in January, that has pushed the timeline back. And so currently we're still waiting to hear when a lot of these markups will happen. It's looking like we will see some markups soon in the form of May, we hope. We're hearing that the president will send his skinny budget to Congress around the beginning of April, and then his full budget in May. And so about that time, Congress should start doing its work. We expect the House to move first, as they have in recent years, and hopefully have their bills passed by the end of July before the August recess. And then we would look to see the Senate take those up in the fall. And again, Congress has not passed all 12 appropriations bills as separate bills in, I don't know, 20 years or so. And so we will probably see a package of those bills. And even last year, if you look at the what happened with appropriations, the Senate didn't pass a single bill, and the House passed 10 of their 12 bills on the floor, and the other two out of committee, but they didn't pass the House floor. So we could see some mix of that going forward in FY22. The other thing I wanted to mention about that is we are hearing that earmarks are likely going to come back. This has been something that Congress has been talking about for a while. They were banned by House Republicans back in 2011, I believe, and Senate Republicans followed suit. And so we haven't seen earmarks. This is also being referred to as member-directed spending, which there were a lot of scandals when earmarks were in Congress in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is one of the reasons that they got rid of them. But now they're bringing them back, and the House Democrats have put out some strict guidelines around those, how those can be used. They can't be more than 1% of any appropriations bill. Each member would only be allowed to request up to 10 earmarks. They can only go to nonprofits and state and local governments, quasi-governmental agencies, so they couldn't go to for-profit companies. So that was put out by House Democrats a couple months ago. Yesterday, House Republicans voted to bring back earmarks, and so they are going to be part of that process. It's still unsure what's going to happen in the Senate. Senate Dems have indicated that they want to bring back earmarks, but Senate Republicans have not, and so we do need to wait and see if they will actually come back, because the Senate would have to do that as well. So that is something to look out for, and something that you all should start planning for, potentially reaching out to your members of Congress to ask what their deadlines are for member-directed spending and how you can be a part of that process. Each office will likely have an online form that you will fill out in order to request that they submit those to the appropriators. And then the last thing I just want to touch on is a future potential infrastructure package. This is also being called a recovery package. We don't have a definite path forward yet. Yesterday, House Progressives were at the White House talking with them about their priorities. It's looking like they might break a bill up into 3 separate bills, is what's been floated. It's something that Democrats could do via reconciliation, like they have done, like they did for this most recent bill, but it's something that there's a lot of bipartisan support for a lot of stuff within the transportation infrastructure world. And so we would like to see a bipartisan bill, but it remains to be seen whether Republicans will get on board with what Democrats want to do, especially with progressives wanting to put things in there around climate change and green energy and things like that. So currently, House and Senate Democrats are working with the White House on drafting those bills. Again, we'll see if Republicans join in on that process and if there's any outreach to Democrats by Senate and House leaders, to Republicans by Senate and House Democrats. So that's all I have for you today. I do want to just put in a quick plug to attend the National Arts Action Summit. It will be April 5th to 9th, and there's full registration support available to anybody. We will be talking about a lot of these issues and talking to you guys about how you can advocate best when you go talk to your members of Congress. And then the following week is will hopefully be a week of meetings for everybody to meet with their members of Congress and senators and discuss the things that we talk about during the Action Summit.
Thank you, Peter. A question that's come up that kind of connects both what you're talking about and our previous speakers on state and local block grant comes from our Facebook Live listener and saying, I'm not sure if it's going to be addressed, but 40 years ago, the arts sector was able to utilize state and local block grants under the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. By the end of the program, 10,000 artists had been hired. And it goes on a little bit. So let me take a crack at answering it and see, Peter, if you have anything you want to add. But that is a combination of what can be done with the state and local block grant. That program, which is called CETA, was really a federal program that was asking the state and locals to use some of those funds to do that workforce project. So the answer is these state block grants and local block grants are very fungible. They can use it for anything that the state and local government, within the parameters, which are fairly broad that Jay outlined in a previous slide, they can use it for a lot of things. And we already know in the first go around of the CARES Act, some states and locals, the state of California and the city of San Francisco, are putting jobs programs in place that are for the arts. And there are some other places that happened. So there's nothing that prevents the governor, the mayors to do that. The only thing is they need those ideas coming from our field to say, this is what we need to do. But in top of that, Peter, under the area of future recovery legislation, there is a massive effort, and you can see it if you Google putting creative workers back to work, There's a very large field-wide effort to develop a federal program under the Build Back Better framework of a workforce program for the arts. And as much as this legislation of recovery is called infrastructure, infrastructure is being defined as also workforce development. And it could very well include something like that. And there is a lot of lobbying effort going on along that. Peter, do you want to add anything?
Don't want to add anything to that, but I do want to answer a question that I just saw. The question was, does member directed spending go through the House, the Senate, or both? Again, each bill has to be identical. That's passed by the House and the Senate. So it would likely go both between the House and the Senate. And so, again, we're just waiting to see what the Senate will end up doing in terms of bringing them back and what their guidelines will be, but it will go through both. And so you can contact both your members of your representatives as well as your senators to see what their internal deadlines are for constituents to give their input before they have to give their input to the appropriations subcommittees.
And what's nice about that is that the money has to go to a nonprofit organization or a governmental, quasi-governmental kind of agency. So that's a good part of our field. If you are individual artists working with nonprofits, you can relay this information to them. This will pay off if you've been cultivating a relationship with your members of Congress all this time. You can be in their short list of a possible member designated grant to your organization, and that's what they are grants. Okay.
And just
Yeah.
one really quick follow-up to that, who do you start with? You should do both at the same time. You shouldn't prioritize one or the other.
It's just that the House might be getting ready earlier to take those requests, it seems like, possibly.
Yes, they are likely, because they have formally said they will do it, but I would contact both offices at the same time. Just
And the
to make
deadline could be as early as mid-April.
Yep.
Yeah. So start working on it now. They may not be ready to take those applications, but start getting the information, getting yourself known to those members, so that when the portal opens, you're ready to go. Don't do this without having a previous relationship. I think you need to have some kind of connection. Okay, we are going to now move on to probably the area we got the most questions about, and that is PPP and shuttered venues. I'm going to take on the PPP section first, and then my colleague Nate McGaha at Arts North Carolina is going to handle the shuttered venue. We're going to try to leave as much time as possible for questions in this area. So let's see if we can get a lot covered, especially of some of the questions we already know that you have. So the PPP program was created in the CARES Act, but several times money has been added, and money was more added again for the Paycheck Protection Program in this most recent act. And in terms of what's still available, it's about $125 billion still available. Banks have had a harder time in getting the funds run through the SBA as quickly as they did last time. There were very few rules. It was kind of like Wild Wild West in getting things in. And it's now more methodical, lots of hoops you have to go through. So that's good for those of you who haven't submitted your PPP request, but there is still 125 billion, and the likelihood of the deadline being extended is looking better and better every day to May 31st. But we're going to go over some reasons, especially those interested in a shuttered venue grant, of why you should go sooner. So here we go. For the PPP, the same rule applies of if you are on unemployment, you cannot also collect and use your PPP during that covered period. So what does that mean? If you take out a PPP with a covered period of, say, February 1 to March 31st, during that, and remember, that's for payroll, to pay yourself, especially if you're this really applies to self-employed people, because you're the only ones who can get both unemployment and a PPP. So for those of you who fit into that category, just know that while you're on unemployment, you cannot be having a PPP covered period. That's why if you want both, which you can have both, you just can't have them at the same time. You can apply for your PPP going from, like I mentioned as an example, let's say February 1 through the end of March, and let's say that equals about 8 weeks. Just don't certify your weekly unemployment and pass it for the next 8 weeks. And then if you're still out of work and you're still not picking up any jobs here and there, go back on unemployment after you finish your covered period. The key here is to be smart about how you do it. You have choices now. It can be a covered period of minimum 8 weeks and maximum 24 weeks and anything in between. And if you're someone who's trying to get both, it's to your advantage to make it a short 8-week program. Another key thing about PPP is when you, in the early days and the early forgiveness applications, you had to subtract the amount of the EIDL advance that you had gotten so that you couldn't also get that as a separate grant. But now you don't have to do that, which is terrific. And you are able to get full forgiveness of that PPP. And let's say you're a self-employed person and you got a $1,000 advance for your EIDL, you are going to be able to keep both as a grant for yourself. The deadline, as we've been speaking a lot about it now, but the deadline on the books as of today is March 31st to get your second draw application for a PPP, or if you never got one in 2020, to get your first draw. For those of you who never applied for a PPP in 2020, if you're smart and you got your PPP early in 2021, like right after it passed, by around January 11th, they reopened the portal. You actually have a chance of getting a second PPP, just so that it puts you on an even playing field with everyone else who got one in 2020 and they're coming in for their second draw in 2021. If you never took a draw in 2020, you have the chance of getting 2 draws in 2021, especially easier now that the extension looks like it's going to happen to May 31st. You just need a little time. You can't overlap them. So you need an 8-week PPP and then go for a second draw. A reminder that you don't have to complete a forgiveness application before you apply for a second PPP. Now, there are some banks, especially if you jump to a different bank for your second draw, because you're not required to stay with the same bank or lender. If you jump to another bank, some of them I hear are requiring that you complete a forgiveness application on your first one before you do your second one. Listen, you can shop around and look for a bank that fits what you can do right now. The big thing that happened in the American Rescue Plan that affects those that are shuttered venues and talent representatives and museums, aquariums that have fixed seating auditoriums that they do some kind of presentations about. You now actually have the right to be able to get a PPP and a shuttered venue. There are, of course, complications because SBA is constantly your fountain of opportunity and your nemesis of the details. And it continues to be that issue here. So here, what you have as a situation is there are people who held out not getting a PPP because they wanted to go for a shuttered venue, and the shuttered venue still has not opened, and so there were long delays. But now you can apply, and that's as of March 11th, that law got enacted, but they have not updated the forms. And there are complications related to that, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. Let's go to the next slide so I can do it in real time. Next slide, Marissa. Thank you. So this is an example of one of the confirmation certifications that you have to make on a PPP loan application. And it is on specifically the forms that are for non-Schedule C filers, which means you're not self-employed. So this goes to anybody who is an organization, a corporation, things like that. On your forms, which is form 2483, or if you're going for a second draw, it's 2483 SD, standing for second draw. One of the certifications on there, on page 2, says the applicant has not and will not receive a shuttered venue operator grant from SBA. This is causing a lot of problems for organizations after after March 11th, when the Congress passed the law that said you can now get both. This application form has not changed since March 3rd. So there's a delay. And banks need to rely on information from the SBA that tells them it's okay. And what's happening is that if you do not check that off, certifying that you will not apply or receive a shuttered venue, even though you have every intention and every legal right to get it, this application will be bounced back by the SBA currently, even if the bank allows you to not show it as checked off. Even if the bank proceeds to submit it to the SBA, it's bouncing it back and not allowing you to process the application. The SBA has not given guidance on what to do for an applicant in this scenario because the clock is ticking. Banks have created artificially early deadlines for submitting an application for a PPP this year because of all these extra hurdles that they have to go through. Some have already closed their application date. People like Chase Bank closes it tomorrow and what they're trying to say is we cannot guarantee we can process this application unless you get it to us by the 19th of March. Now, this is likely all going to change if Congress passes that extension for the PPP, but at the moment, it's only been passed in the House, and that's why I wanted Peter to go ahead of me, but it's looking good for it being extended. If you are really set on sticking with a particular bank that has one of these artificial early deadlines, I'm just going to, I can't tell you what to do. I'm just going to tell you what I would do if it were me. And if it were me, I would still check it off and say, you're certifying that because there is enough regulations and laws and legislation that have been passed that say you are eligible and that this is a glitch because this form is dated March 11th and March 3rd and the law passed on March 11th. Next slide for the breaking news now. So minutes before we came on live, the SBA released what are called interim final rules. And these are federal regulations that require, and they're called interim because they're saying these are what our final rules are, but we leave open a few days for comment period for people to respond back to us. And after we review those comments, they become final. So there's a delay here. So it's going to take a few days before they become final. And then it's going to take a few days before they change the form. But here's the good news. They are removing the thing I had circled in the previous slide, certifying you will not apply for a shuttered venue. Instead, the line is going to be replaced with this. And it's going to say, the applicant has not been approved for a shuttered venue operator grant from SBA as of the date of this loan application. And the applicant acknowledges that if the applicant is approved for a shuttered venue operator grant before SBA issues a loan number for the PPP, the applicant is ineligible for the loan and acceptance of any loan proceeds will be considered an unauthorized use. That's a lot of mumbo jumbo, but essentially it's what they're saying is that by the time you submit a PPP application, you cannot have already been awarded a shuttered venue application. So it has to go in this order. You get your PPP and then you get your shuttered venue. And the law now says, and SBA guidelines have come out officially in saying, you cannot get a PPP loan after receiving a shuttered venue grant. That is very clear. You cannot go in that order. And that's why this certification is written in this way. Because if you're applying for a PPP, by the time you've already received a shuttered venue, you cannot certify this. So the good news is they are correcting the problem. The bad news is the clock is ticking. You want to get your PPP loan. You're desperate for money. What do you do? And I've given you an idea what I would do, but things are going to change pretty rapidly if the law gets enacted of extending the May 31st deadline. The banks will then relieve the tension of these artificial early deadlines, and they'll by then have the new loan application form for you to use where you don't have to falsely state you won't go for a shuttered venue. So I'm leaving it in your best hands, and I've given you what I thought I would do. Okay, next slide, please. So the other thing that changed that was really sensational, and it did not require an act of legislation. It required the act of an executive branch hand changing it, and that's through President Biden. And what it is that they saw that how unfair the PPP formula was for self-employed people who file a Schedule C. Because for all of 2020, your PPP application was based on your net profit, which for many self-employed people, after you take out all of your expenses, it's pretty close to zero, sometimes negative even. So if you have to multiply that divide it by 12 and then multiply it by 2.5, you're going to end up with close to zero. And many people were under 1,000, and that doesn't even meet their minimum. So they never got a PPP. So what the law did was, what President Biden did is that he changed it in early March, and he changed it so that self-employed individuals who file a Schedule C, and that's the key. If you are a subchapter S and it's still only you that you're employing, but you didn't file a Schedule C, you filed the other tax return for subchapter S's, you cannot take advantage of this new rule. And what the rule is that now you can base it on your gross revenue off of your Schedule C rather than your net profit. And to get to the pearly gates to be able to get this form, you have to use this very specific form, which is the third bullet, form 2483-C. And the C is in reference to Schedule C. It is only on this form or its second draw form, SD-C, that you will see the opportunity to write down your gross revenue. If you are using any of the old forms, you will not be able to create the formula based on your gross revenue as opposed to your net profit. The banks and the lenders will not do it for you. They will not change it for you. They will not modify it for you. So here's the current problem we're having. The lenders have not gotten, it took, even though President Biden made this change, I believe on March 3rd, no, I'm sorry, on February 27th, the change was made. The SBA did not come out with the details of what it meant until March 3rd. And they did not come out with these new forms until March 3rd as well. And there are banks across the country as of today on March 18th who still have no idea what self-employed individuals are talking about when they say, where is your Schedule C form for the PPP application? There is a real drag time between lenders getting this information, changing their portals to accommodate the Schedule C form. You have to find the right lender to help accommodate you right now. You cannot work it through one of the old forms. I can't tell you this enough. You have to use this particular form or your lender's version of this form. Important news for those of you who applied for a PPP using the old form, but have not been funded yet with an SBA loan through your lender, and the money hasn't come into your account. You still have an opportunity to make a change here. And what you have to do is you literally have to tell your lender to cancel the existing pending application that you have with them. You have to get it canceled, and then you have to reapply using the Schedule C form that I have there in bullets 3 and 4. That is the only way at the moment that you can get the larger amount of money. And I can guarantee you it's the difference of thousands of dollars of how much you can get as a forgivable loan as opposed to pennies under the old system. Please do that as quickly as possible. For those of you who have already been funded this year with a new PPP that you were a Schedule C filer, at the moment, the SBA and the Biden administration are very aware of the inequity in that, but they don't have a fix for it yet to allow you to go back and modify to get a larger loan. So right now, the best thing is to just stay put. And if you have an opportunity to complain to your legislators and to the White House that it's unfair and that they need to fix this, please do that, because the squeaky wheel does make a difference here. Just as we've gotten fixes in a lot of other areas, I believe that this will be fixed, but I need your voices to help make sure they hear that it needs to be fixed. So let's just go to the next slide, and I just want to show you what the new form looks like. So this is that Schedule C form, and there's one for first draw, which is this, and if it were a second draw, under the first circle, it would say SDC. And it's right here is the second circled area where it says gross income. None of the other PPP loan applications have that, only the ones for Schedule C. And you can base it on either 2019 or 2020. Okay, next slide. So I'm just going to quickly do forgiveness so we can move on to the big topic of shuttered venues, because I know we're running a little late. These are your application forms for forgiveness. Just a couple things for you to know. One is you still need to complete your forgiveness application within 10 months of your covered period ending, not the beginning of your covered period, of your covered period ending. Second, there are 3 kinds of forms. Take advantage of what I think applies to most of you, which is the first one, 3508S, which stands for short form. That is an easier form than the easy form, which is right below it. The S form can be for all self-employed tax filers and for anybody who got a loan of $150,000 or less. If you got more than 150, you're going to have to use one of the other 2. Okay, I'm going to now take it to my colleague, Nate. We can go to the next slide. And Nate, I'm going to give you more time. I'm sorry I took some of your time, but this is the biggest area of interest. So I'm going to hand it over to you to go over shuttered venues. Nate has become a real expert in this area. Please go for it.
Thank you very much, Nina. It is really, everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Great. My name is Nate McGackie. I'm the Executive Director of Arts North Carolina. It's probably really confusing. You're looking at this slide and trying to figure out how on earth I pronounce my name McGackie when it's spelled that way. I don't have a very good explanation for you, but I will say that it makes sense that I'm talking about shuttered venue operators grants, because just the same way, that is a very confusing name, because as we're going to talk about, there are a lot of organizations that don't necessarily operate a shuttered venue that also are eligible for this grant. And we're definitely going to talk more about that later. Also, I know we're tight on time, and folks in North Carolina will tell you that sometimes listening to me talk is like drinking from a fire hose. So I promise that you might get a little wet, but you won't leave thirsty. And everything I'm going to be talking about is primarily on the slides. So don't worry if you're getting a little lost along the way. I want to start off with these resources. The SBA is completely operating this program. They're processing all of the applications. They're going to be making decisions on all of the grants. They're the ones that's going to be sending out the money. It's not like the PPP where you're contacting a lender. So that first link is the SBO grant website. It is under construction. It seems like every so often it's always changing, constant updates at the SBA, as well as the FAQs, which is the link right below that. And we were discussing earlier before the presentation how the FAQs always seem to come out middle of the day or end of the day on Friday. So this is how I spend my Friday nights now, is reading SBO grant FAQs, or maybe Saturday morning with my coffee. So that's the best place to get accurate information, but they are, there's been a lot of changes. If you've been following along with this, they've been continuously changing the wording and redefining terms and things of that nature. It is a little hard to keep on top of. So always make sure that you're looking at the most recent FAQs, as well as checking the website on a regular basis. Also here is a bunch of other resources, eligibility requirements, application checklist. I think that eligibility requirements actually got updated, I think earlier today. So there's a new one from March 5th. So just like I said, lots of great resources and some good video tutorials as well. Next slide, please. So when I first started talking about these grants, I realized that I actually put the slides in the order of the way the legislation is written, which put talking about how much the grants were for kind of somewhere near the end. And I realized I was burying my lead. So we're going to talk about how great the cheese is before we ask you to navigate the maze. And what we're talking about here is the initial grant for all qualified applicants is going to be 45% of your gross earned revenue during 2019, or $10 million, whichever is less, right? So it's capped at $10 million, but other than that, it's 45% of your gross earned revenue. What is earned revenue? So revenue is all of the money that comes in. Gross revenue, also a term, means all of the money comes in. Earned revenue is specifically money for goods or services. So rentals, admissions, tuitions if you're a school, concessions, merchandise. So all of those, all of that revenue for goods and services is considered earned revenue. Those of you in the nonprofit realm talk about the other stuff as contributed revenue. But in terms of this grant, it's either earned revenue or it's not earned revenue, which then puts it into gross revenue. I want to touch a little bit on sponsorships and also fundraising galas, how to versus, because they're going to look at this two different ways for sponsorships, depending on whether or not you are for-profit or nonprofit. If you are a for-profit that has a sponsorship for an event at your for-profit venue, then you are going to consider 100% of that sponsorship as earned revenue. If you are a nonprofit, you're going to take the total of that sponsorship, and then you are going to consider the value of the benefit, be that advertising or ticket or what have you that comes with that sponsorship. That is going to be considered earned revenue, and then the remainder of that sponsorship would be considered just regular revenue or contributed revenue if we were, for those of you in the nonprofit industry. Same kind of thing when you're talking about fundraisers and galas. If you're charging $250 a plate and it costs you $50 a plate, you would consider $50 of that as earned revenue in 2019, and you would consider the rest of that as contributed revenue or just into your total revenue. For those entities that began after 2019, there's a separate calculation for you. You're going to take all of your gross revenue in 2019, and then you're going to divide it by the number of full months. So if you opened on February 15th, you would only be counting March through December. And you're going to take that number of full months, divide that divide the full revenue by the number of full months you were open, multiply that by 6, and that is how you're going to come up with your calculation instead of the 45%. And if you opened in like January, February of 2020, there's a slightly different calculation for you. In addition to the initial grants, there's also supplemental grants of 50% of your initial grant award. So if you got $50,000 for 45%, if it was $50,000, then you'll get another $25,000 if you meet certain criteria, if there's still funding available for supplemental grants. And we are going to talk a little bit more of that, but primarily that you would have lost 70% of your loss of your gross revenue. So that's all of your revenue for the most recent calendar quarter as of April 1st, 2021, which is the quarter of the calendar that we are in right now, January through March 31st, compared to Q1 of 2019. And that's if funding's still available. The total of any grants, nobody can get more than $10 million from that grant program. So even if you get the initial grant, the supplemental grant, if you add those two together and it's over 10 million, then you're going to get capped at $10 million. That's the cap of any entity for the program. The original allocation back on December 27th was $15 billion. The American Rescue Plan, along with all the other great allocations and changes you heard, put another $1.25 billion into that. So now we are dealing with a pool of $16.25 billion available to fund this program. And we're going to talk about how many different organizations are going to be tapping into those funds. But now that entities can receive a PPP loan first and have that deducted from your total SVOG amount, I think that's going to help to make that 16.25 last a little bit longer. Now, I know there's been a lot of questions. When is the application portal expected to open? And the SBA just recently, in their most recent round of FAQs, said that they are working expeditiously to get this open in early April. I know that is not a date, but it is a time frame. So we have something to look forward to, that hopefully by the time April 15th rolls around, that we will all be submitting our SVO grant applications. So it is coming. More information is going to be coming from the SBA. They are going to be doing more webinars, and I know that Nina is working very closely with the SBA top brass to make sure that they're going to do a webinar on this platform as well. Now, before we dive into all of these eligibility requirements and definitions and start to, work through this maze of information, I want to remind everybody: don't disqualify yourself. Don't look for the reason why you aren't eligible. If you are in doubt in any way, apply, because it is not your job to figure out your eligibility, nor your priority, which will make sense in a second and probably make sense to you. That is the Small Business Administration's job. You just need to fill out that form honestly, and they will figure out whether or not you qualify and take your application. They will figure out where you fall in the program. So you don't have to do that. You just have to apply. Next slide, please. So who is eligible? I'm going to try and move through these definitions pretty quickly, but really live venue operators and promoters, theatrical producers, live performing arts organization operators, and actually Nina and I got a chance to work a little bit with the SBA on defining that, along with some other great arts leaders as well. Relevant museum operators, which is just a museum. Also included in that definition are places like aquariums and zoos and things like that. Motion picture theater operators and talent representatives or talent agents. So a live venue theater live venue operator or promoter, as their principal business activity, they're going to do one of two things. They are either organizing, promoting, producing, managing, or hosting events by performing artists and charging admission for that. And then also making sure that those artists are paid either on a percentage of sales, some kind of guarantee, or a mutually beneficial arrangement. Or under the definition of this program, they are publicly selling tickets on average 60 days in advance of a performing arts event and paying the performers with some sort of, a contract, a percentage of sales, a mutually beneficial arrangement. I know a lot of you probably fit into that category, may fit into performing arts operator as well. A theatrical producer is someone who, an individual or entity that produces theatrical productions, right? That has a vested financial interest in that theatrical production, not rental companies, right? So if you are, let's say if you are a producer and you are putting together a touring show, you would apply. If you are the lighting company that's providing the equipment for that touring show, you are not eligible for a shuttered venue operator grant, only for the theatrical producer. Under the live performing arts organization operator, an entity which meets the criteria that is established in the law, that creates, produces, performs, or presents live performance for audiences in a qualifying venue, and we'll talk more about that, which includes, but is not limited to, amphitheaters, concert halls, auditoriums, theaters, clubs, festivals, and schools. So a pretty wide range of folks falling under that performing arts or operator category there. The relevant art museum, now this is actually based on a pre-existing federal definition that I think IMLS worked on of what a museum is: a public, tribal, or private nonprofit that utilizes a professional staff and is organized on a permanent basis to fulfill cultural, educational, or aesthetic purposes through an exhibition of tangible objects to the general public. And really we're talking about, I think we all know what a museum is and how they're putting that, have to be exhibited to the public for the purpose of cultural, educational, and aesthetic purposes. That obviously does qualify for art museums. Motion picture theater operator, this is pretty much, this definition is pretty tied directly to the grant. Must have at least one screen with one projection booth, an area with fixed audience seating, and we're going to talk about who has to deal with fixed audience seating and who doesn't, but movie theaters definitely do, as do museums, that market their show times and listings either by print or electronic means and charge admission, right? That is what they are considering a motion theater operator. And lastly, talent representatives. And for the purpose of this grant, it is an agent or business that spends no less than 70% of their business operations putting together time or putting contracts together and getting work for at least 2 or more artists or entertainers that primarily work in the live performing arts industry. So, you know, if you're a talent representative for movie actors, this grant is not for you. It is for primarily live performance talent representatives. Moving on to the next slide, please. So, who is eligible and who isn't eligible? And this is really a question that's caused some confusion, particularly around gross revenue and earned revenue. And also, eligible entities are also what will eventually be called, as we're going through this, third priority. So anybody that is eligible for the program, third priority is where you fall. And what eligible entity is a for-profit, nonprofit, or government-operated live performance venue operator or promoter, talent representative, theatrical producers, performing arts organization, relevant museum, and motion picture theater operators. All those 6 folks that we just talked about before. And like I said, either for-profit, nonprofit, or owned by the government. You have to have been in operations before February 29th of 2020. You have to be able to show that your gross earned revenue, right? That's the for goods and services, admissions, merchandise, concessions, et cetera. Your gross earned revenue in only one calendar quarter of 2020 was 25% less than the same calendar quarter for 2019. So, you know, I think that pretty much covers a wide swath, if not the entirety of the performing arts industry because of the pandemic. So 25% of gross earned revenue, 25% loss in just one single quarter, 19 compared to 20. And also on the day the grant is issued, you have to be either operating or intending to operate in the future. In other words, if you have already said that you are going out of business and you have closed your doors, then you cannot receive this grant because you're no longer in operation. If you're not operating because of COVID restrictions, you have to certify that you have every intention of operating in the future. I know we've talked about it a lot, but I am going to talk about it one last time. An entity may now apply for all those things that Nina said for your first or second draw PPP loan, and then apply for your shuttered venue operator grant. And then your SVOG is going to be reduced by whatever the amount of your PPP loan is. After that, after you apply for your SVOG or after you receive your SVOG, you cannot apply for a PPP. Another important note, it does not matter about what amount of your PPP loan is forgiven. It is the total amount of your PPP loan, regardless of how much you're getting forgiven, is deducted from your SVOG. So what will make you ineligible? So issue of securities, that basically means you cannot be someone that is publicly traded on a stock exchange. Now here's one that's caused some consternation. You can't receive more than 10% of your gross revenue from the federal government unless you are a state and local government or a public college or university that is owned and operated by a state or local government. I will say that, so if you are a performing arts center that's connected to a private university that private university gets more than 10% from the federal government, then you would be excluded. But public colleges and universities are fine, as well as state and local governments. They can get more than 10% from the feds as well. Also, you cannot offer performances, services, and merchandise of an excessively sexual nature. I think that is pretty self-explanatory. I hope we don't get many questions about exactly what that means. And then you can have no more than 2 of the following 3 characteristics, right? So you can't have venues in more than 1 country or venues in more than 10 states and have more than 500 full-time employees. So if you have a venue in one in Canada and one in the US, then that's okay, as long as you don't also have more than 500 full-time equivalent employees. If you have businesses in 11 states, that's okay, as long as you don't also have more than 500 employees. But any 2 of those is going to disqualify you. All right, moving on to the next slide, please. So we're going to dive in a little bit more about who is eligible on each one of those 6 eligible entities that we talked about. First, we're going to hit the live venue operators, performing arts organizations, and theatrical producers. And I know that that's 3 different groups, but they really are all kind of have to meet very similar criteria. You're going to have to meet one of these 2 criteria. You either need to make at least 70% of your earned revenue from tickets and admissions charges, production fees, like rental fees, etc., concessions and merchandise, or nonprofit educational activities, or a live performance venue that sells admission to live performances at least 60 days in advance and pays the artist through a percentage contract or other mutually beneficial arrangement. So going back to that first one, talking about that earned revenue. So we talked about how earned revenue was everything that you did for a good or service, but this particular 70%, as we understand it now, has to be specifically tied to a live performance. So let's say that you are a ballet school or a ballet company, but that you get tuition for class. Those tuitions for classes are not directly tied, so likely would not count. Though the tickets that you sold to the showcase or whatever performance you had would count. That being said, we don't know. I don't want anyone to disqualify themselves based on this alone. So fill out the application and let the SBA decide. Also, these performance, and this is for not only for venues, but performing arts organizations and theatrical producers about the venues where they do their performances. There has to be a clearly defined audience and performance area, right? It has to make perfect sense when you walk in there. Where is the stage and where does the audience go? Whether or not that's indoor or outdoor. But you do not, I repeat, you do not have to have fixed seatings if you're a live venue operator, performing arts organization, or theatrical producer. That is only for museums, and that is only for movie theaters. You got to charge admission. But there is a caveat to that as well. So nonprofits that provide a free event, right? Let's just say that you do a show at noon, 2, and 4 every day, and you do it all, you fund it through donations or something, and so you're doing free events, but they are primarily operated by paid staff, you are still eligible. But for most folks, you got to charge some kind of admission. You got to advertise through print and online media or other media, fairly pay staff or performers. I think we've covered that means a wide variety of mutually beneficial agreements. And this is clear, and this is a huge sigh of relief to our community theater operators, as well as some volunteer choruses and chorales. Organizations with volunteer performers should still be eligible if they have paid staff. And the paid staff are primarily the ones that are making the production operate. So those organizations are still eligible as we understand it now. You have to engage one or more person doing at least 2 of the following positions. This does not mean that they need to be an employee. You just need to engage them through some means, 1099 contractors, et cetera, to be a sound engineer, a stage manager, security personnel, box office manager, booker, or promoter. The FAQs have got more specific definitions. I never thought I'd be working on a piece of legislation where we define what a stage manager is, but here we are. You also have to use certain equipment. You have to use all of these three things: mixing equipment, PA system, and a lighting rig. So again, all of those things we have up on the or in the FAQs for a deeper definition, but you have to have all three of those pieces of equipment. Next slide, please. So moving on to the other groups, relevant museums, you got to operate a nonprofit museum as its principal business. This is what you do. You have to have at least one indoor exhibition space that was somehow closed or restricted because of pandemic restrictions, that somehow your capacity was restricted or you had to be closed. You have to have one indoor exhibition space, and then at least one auditorium, theater, or performance or lecture hall with fixed audience seating and regular programming. So yes, if you've got an exhibition hall inside and an amphitheater outside with fixed seating, does that count? Yes. What is fixed audience seating for museums? Look, if you've got bleachers that kind of pull out from the wall but then go away, those bleachers do not easily move from the room. So as long as it's some giant cumbersome thing that does not easily move from the room, that's going to count as fixed seating in a museum. If you put out chairs, then if just putting out chairs in a room and doing programming, that's not going to count as fixed seating. What does regular programming mean? They are defining regular programming as 4 times a month. That basically means an average though. So if you do summer programming, so you only have programming 3 months out of the year, as long as your average is 4 programs per month, then that's going to qualify as a regularly programmed venue. You do not have to charge admission to that program to qualify as a museum operator. Talent representatives. So those guys, like we said, have to have 70% of their entire operation representing professional artists, primarily for live performances, as described as all of those things that we talked about in live performance venues. And then motion picture theater operators, probably the easiest to define: one screen, one projection booth, seats nailed or bolted to the ground, and you got to advertise and charge admission. And then of course there's all those other caveats to keep it from being, large multi-state movie theater operations. This is for your mom and pop, locally owned movie theater, independent movie theater operators, not massive multinational corporations. Important note, I don't put things in red for a reason. If you have not gotten your DUNS number and your SAM account, please do so now. It does take some time to apply and get the number back. That link will take you to a video where the SBA is done that sort of walks you through that process. So please go ahead and get that done immediately. It is very important. A few notes on the calculation when we're talking about eligibility. Full-time equivalent employees. In order to be a full-time employee, you have to work more than 30 hours a week. If you work between 10 and 30 hours a week, it counts as half a full-time employee. If you work less than 10 hours a week, that counts as 0 employees. Very clear, this is not your 1099 workers. This is not those independent contractors. This is only for full-time employees. Remember that there's actually nothing that we're going to talk about that says you have to have full-time employees in order to qualify for this. There's caveats that keep you from having more than 500 if you meet certain criteria. And specifically, there's a pool of money we're going to talk about for organizations that have less than 50 employees. So this is to calculate whether or not you fall into that category, which may be advantageous. The SBA is going to have some alternative methods for seasonal employers. CARES Act funding is not counted in your gross revenue. So really any of the federal funding that we're talking about is not counted as gross revenue, so you don't have to worry about your PPP loan from last year throwing off your numbers. You're going to use accrual accounting to do this, and there was some confusion about this a few weeks ago. Audited financials are not required in any way, shape, or form for in order to apply for an SVO grant. If you're getting more than $750,000, there's going to be some requirements for audits on the back end. But in this moment, you do not need an audited financial. That was going to be too cumbersome. All right, moving on to the next slide. So the priority periods, and I know this has caused a lot of confusion for folks that have been going through this process. What are the priority periods, and do you have to know what priority period? Again, your application will determine your priority period. You don't have to do so. But really what's going to happen is that they're going to accept all of the applications for the SVOG, and then they are going to take the first 14 days to process those applications that show a 90% loss of gross revenue April 1st through December 31st of 2020, as compared to the same period in 2019 resulting from the pandemic. Priority 2 happens as soon as first priority is over. So the funding goes out for priority 1, we move to priority 2 on day 15. Same thing, only it's those that have a 70% loss of gross revenue between April 1st and December 31st of 2020, as compared to the same period in 2019. And then priority 3, which is all other eligible entities, after 28 days, that's when they're going to process those applications. As we have discussed, in this priority period only is based on earned revenue, a 25% loss of earned revenue for a single calendar quarter, 2020 to 2019. Then after all the initial grant periods are over, we've moved through priority 1 through 3. We can then move on to the supplemental grants, which we talked about at the beginning, which would be 50% of the first grant you got. If you have a 70% loss of the most recent calendar quarter as of April 1st, 2021, which is the one that we are in, compared to 2019. Again, don't disqualify yourself. Answer the application questions honestly, and the SBA is going to determine where you fall in the priority range and what eligibility. And we think that they're going to open up the applications for everybody at the same time. So you don't have to make these determinations. You just have to fill out the application. 80% of the funds, no more than 80% of the funds can be spent in the first 28 days. So yes, that means that 80% of the funds may be spent. And if you fall into priority 3, then there will only be 20% less, but that is still several billions of dollars. So there's still probably going to be ample funding when we get, so don't let that worry you, don't let that discourage you, go ahead and apply. And like we talked about earlier, the SBA is going to set aside at least $2 billion for entities with 50 or fewer full-time employees. And that's the calculation that you're using that FTE count for, and hopefully that will be advantageous to smaller employers. So that set aside, they're going to be pulling funding out of that set aside while they're doing awards for priority 1, 2, and 3. Next slide, please. So how are you going to be allowed to spend this money? Allowable expenses, initial grants must be used for allowable expenses that are incurred between March 1st and December 31st and paid within 1 year. So you can buy something on December 15th and then pay the invoice in January. If that's within 1 year of when you got the money, that is perfectly fine. It's 1 year you have, but all of the expenses have to be incurred before December 31st of 2021. Supplemental grants, you get a little bit more time. All of the expenses have to be incurred before June 30th of 2022. So March 1 through June 30th, 2022, and paid within 18 months of receiving the funds. Allowable expenses, this is a long list. Payroll, equipment, rent, utilities, insurance, workers' protection, 1099 employees or workers, excuse me, do count. Worker protection expenditures, most mortgage payments, business expenses, maintenance costs, administrative costs, state and local taxes. And in addition to all of those things, you can also spend it on advertising, travel, and capital expenditures for live performances, though that can't be the primary use of the funds. I think they want to see it more spent on mortgages, rent, utilities, payroll, and equipment, but you can spend some of it on capital expenses and advertising, etc. What can you not spend it on? You cannot buy real estate, right? So you can't go out and pick up a new mortgage after February 15th, right? It had to be something that was a real estate that you owned or a mortgage payment before February 15th. You cannot reloan these funds out to other entities or individuals. You cannot invest these funds, and you cannot make political donations. A little note here on owner compensation. If you are the owner of the business in question, you can use the funds to the extent, as long as you don't exceed your compensation in 2019. So an owner cannot take more for his own compensation than what he made in 2019. If an owner is been putting personal funds into the business, and I know a lot of people have been doing that to keep it in operation, if you have documented the transfer of those funds and have ample and sufficient documentation that you have put those funds into the business, then you will be able to recoup those funds. And the last thing I will say is grant use of this is going to be determined by the SBA. The SBA didn't say that. It was actually written by Congress into the law, specifically telling the SBA that they need to look hard for noncompliance and fraud. So you need to keep all of your grant receipts. You need to retain all of your employment records for 4 years and all other financial records for 3 years. So yes, this is a lot of money. This is going to be a game changer grant, but you're going to have to keep really good records moving forwards because the SBA is going to want to see proof. And I think I will leave it. I think we're heading into Q&A now, right, Nina?
Yes. First of all, a huge round of applause. I know everyone out there is applauding you because that was a lot. And what you should know, everyone in the audience, is that we are still going to have a dedicated Shuttered Venues webinar when the SBA releases its formal guidelines and application. Before we do Q&A, I want, because it's 4:46, we had thought that we would end by 4:30. I'm going to jump to our NEA guests, and then for those who want to stay on and get some Q&A in with Nate, because that's where a good number of the questions are, we're going to stay on. Nate, can you stay on later?
I can stay on. My wife is taking the kid to ballet today. I'm all good.
Okay, good. So we're going to jump over to the NEA and then come back to you later.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so I would love to now bring on Ra Joy and Chen Chang, who Jen is going to go first. These are our new political appointees under the Biden administration to the NEA. They began working there on the first day, January 20th, and sworn into their position by the president himself. Ra is the chief of staff, and Jen is the White House liaison at the NEA and senior advisor to the chief of staff. Jen, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Nina. And I'm grateful to you and to everyone, all of our colleagues at AFTA for hosting this. It's clear from the dialogue and the active Q&A that everyone is extremely interested in these topics, and the service that you all are providing to this community is really fantastic. So thank you so much. I also want to extend a particular word of solidarity and condolence to members of the Asian American community in the face of the horrible tragedy in Atlanta. Please know that we're at the NEA, we're grieving too, and I personally have been looking to art and music for solace in this time. So I think the discussion that we're about to have is a little bit at a different stage. And so, I invite everyone to, you all have been on this webinar for quite some time. I invite you to take a look off of your screen, stretch a little bit, because the conversation we're going to have is not quite as in the details as what you've been looking at, but we're hoping to still position this as the beginning of a long conversation with all of you. So today marks 1 week since President Biden signed the ARP into law. So we come to you really in the early stages of designing a program. In the spirit of openness and transparency and collaboration, we want to give an update on everything we know as of today and everything we're able to share. But please know, again, this is really the beginning of a conversation. We'll come back to these forums. I'm not sure I'll be able to do as great a job as Nate at detailed answers, but we will strive to get to that level of helpful tactical advice for you all. And also, as we think through infrastructure and capacity concerns at all of our organizations, we're hoping that this kind of early, frequent communication will help you all, because we know that the ability to plan in the face of uncertainty is really like one of the most important things that can be a capacity relief. So I'm going to start out by outlining what we know about the NEA's ARP program today. As you've seen, and as you can see here, the NEA received $135 million from the American Rescue Plan, and it's really a testament to all of your work, both from the White House and from Congress. As with any other agency funds, most other agency funding, 40% of this money is going to go to state and regional arts organizations to re-grant to arts organizations directly. The remaining 60% is going to go from the NEA directly to arts organizations. These funds are going to be available for general operating support. They won't be project-based. They will also be non-matching, which will hopefully make them easier to receive and to process. In terms of eligibility, we know that many organizations were not even given the opportunity to apply for CARES Act funding. And we're hoping to open those doors much wider this time by including organizations that are new to NEA funding. This is all in the early stages, as I said, but we're committed to centering equity and inclusion throughout our program design in ways that are frankly new for the agency. It's a huge priority for us. It's a huge priority for the administration, and Rob will speak more to that thinking in a bit. And in terms of timing, we plan to have money to state and regional arts organizations by April, as soon as possible, so that they can begin the process of granting out as well. We also plan to have more information for arts organizations by mid to late April. So please, if you haven't already bookmarked our website and FAQs, we'll plan to update those regularly, as well as posting those types of notifications to our social media accounts. We'll, of course, also be in close touch with Nina throughout, and we'll plan to keep this kind of dialogue going as we finalize the details. We also don't know when the money, if there's any restrictions on when they would need to be spent by, but we're seeking clarity on that front, as well as many other sort of strategic decisions. We also wanted to make sure that you're aware of the full landscape of opportunity for the arts and culture sector that is now being generated by the ARP, since there will certainly be overlap in eligibility, as you all have been talking through. Specifically, we would highlight our partners at the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Corporation for National and Community Service, and make sure that you all are fully aware of everything regarding eligibility and timing for opportunities from those fronts as well. And finally, people have been asking us what they can do before mid-April to help get ready. As Nate spoke about, making sure your sam.gov and grants.gov registrations are complete and accurate is certainly something that will help, not just for us, but for any federal funding. And yes, to echo his point, it can certainly take a while, so getting started early will help. The NEA will also be hosting webinar series sessions regarding funding and more broadly sharing best practices across the field. I just want to highlight this first one that is going to be taking place next Tuesday, March 23rd. The session called The Art of Reopening will feature opening remarks by personal hero, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Then we'll move to a panel of arts organizations who are thinking through the challenges of reopening safely and effectively. That covers most of what we are able to share today about the NEA's funding, and hopefully covers many of your main questions for us. And now we wanted to zoom out a little bit, again, from where this conversation is centered. We'd like to enlist you really as artists, as creators, as lovers of the field, reflecting on what the ARP funding means for all of us on a more personal and spiritual level. And to walk us through that, I'd love to introduce Rod Joy, the Chief of Staff.
Thanks, Jen, and hello, everybody. My name is Rod Joy, and I'm proud to serve as the new Chief of Staff at the National Endowment for the Arts. I want to thank our colleagues at Americans for the Arts and the Arts Action Fund for hosting this incredibly relevant and timely session. 8 weeks in, we had our virtual swearing in just about 8 weeks ago. And I also want to say, on behalf of all of the incoming Biden-Harris appointees at the NEA, just want to say how grateful we are to work for an administration that values the presence and importance of the arts. This commitment to creative expression is not just reflected in maintaining strong cultural agencies, it's embodied in a belief that the arts and creativity have an active role to play across the federal government and in all aspects of civic and community life. I'm going to be incredibly brief so you can get back to Nate in the Q&A session. But just want to say a few words about ARP and a few things that are top of mind as we consider the design of our American Rescue Plan program. So I believe the American Rescue Plan is a signal of hope for arts organizations and creative workers who have been hard hit by the pandemic. I think ARP is a federal acknowledgement of the importance of the creative sector to our economy and our workforce. And most importantly, ARP is a testament to the great work of our many partners and our hosts of this call. Thank you for all that you continue to do to educate Congress and the American people of the role of the arts as a public policy asset. So a few considerations, a few things that are top of mind as we think about ARP. We've been charged with not only focusing on speed of action, but centering some of the values and priorities of the Biden-Harris administration. And the first thing I just want to give voice to briefly is the focus on advancing equity, opportunity, and justice. On day one, President Biden signed an executive order directing a whole of government approach to advancing racial equity. That order directed every U.S. department and agency to conduct a racial equity analysis of their current programs and operations. I have August 8th circled in red on my calendar because that's the date that we have to deliver our report. I also want to say that President Biden and Vice President Harris have put forward an ambitious vision of a more just America. They want to build back and create a better America where equity is paramount, where everyone's human dignity is respected, and where all of our communities can thrive. And whether it's looking back at what happened in Atlanta this past week, and I appreciate Jen's words about that, or thinking about communities that have endured centuries of systemic exclusion, we really want to focus on equity, and we recognize that this is something that is a long-term endeavor, and we're in it for the long haul. But just want to say that we are looking at the American Rescue Plan as an opportunity for the Arts Endowment to begin to focus with more intent on fairness and on equity. And we want to make sure that we're being mindful about how equity shows up in terms of who's eligible for the rescue plan, in terms of who serves on panels, and ultimately who receives grants. And so just wanted to say a word about equity, and that's a topic you'll be hearing a lot more about in the weeks and months ahead. Another piece is a focus on humility. When we think about our design of our ARP program, we want to approach this from a lens of humility and making sure that we're listening to and learning from leaders on the ground who are doing the work. The first thing that we did pretty early on in this process is to look back at the CARES Act and opportunities and obstacles from the lens of getting CARES Act resources out the door. One thing that this administration talks often about is if we mess up, we fess up, and we strive to do better. And I think last go around with CARES, one thing that we've heard loud and clear is we didn't quite get it right when it comes to local arts agencies. So as we think about the American Rescue Plan, we're focused on the role that local arts agencies play as a critical cogs in the arts and cultural ecosystem in the country. While no two local arts agencies are exactly alike, they all play a central role. And we look forward to talking more about how we imagine local arts agencies playing an active role as regranters for ARP funds. In closing, I just want to lift up two ideas, or actually one more idea, and that's essentially expanding access. We recognize that if we limit eligibility for ARP resources to groups that have only received federal funds in the past, it limits the reach of the agency, particularly at a time where we're focused on communities that are traditionally underserved by government. So we really want to open the doors of opportunity with and through ARP, particularly for small and mid-sized organizations. You'll be hearing much more about the NEA and the American Rescue Plan in the weeks and months ahead. We know that this is just the beginning. 135 million is a very, very tiny fraction of the loss that our sector has endured. We want you to see the NEA as a resource, not just today, but every day. We're taking all of the feedback and questions that we're hearing and incorporating them into a FAQ document that will make sure we make it available to Nina and others on this call. But thank you for allowing us an opportunity to drop in on ArtsU, and we look forward to working together.
Thank you, both Ra and Jen. Personally, I just want to say that it is an absolute pleasure working with you. I am so impressed with the energy and thoughtfulness and deliberateness that you have taken in really trying to make a difference at the NEA and making it part of a larger issue of addressing what the needs of the country are and unifying the country through an equity lens and through a fairness lens. I really appreciate it. And we are here to help you in any way we can. Thank you. And I will invite you again in the future for another webinar to talk about specifically the NEA, and we'll have a whole dedicated time on just the NEA. Thank you for being here. Okay, so now for those who want to stay on, I'm going to bring Nate back on. And Nate, you can turn your video and microphone on. Yep. And we're going to start with some questions. And I got to tell you, with all the questions that came in, it's primarily shuttered venue, a few sprinkling of PPP. So I'm going to begin with you, Nate. Here's question number one. And by the way, I'm taking it starting with some of the ones that were submitted in advance. I want to thank those people. So on the tentative checklist of the SVO application list, Nate, it says the SBA wants a copy of the most recent audited financial statement, 2019, or a single audit if applicable. Payroll statements covering through February 29 or beginning February 29, 2020. These items are unrealistic demand for very small organizations who have annual budgets of less than $50,000 even. Is there a way to correct this? What do you know now? I think you have some good news.
I think that you are looking at an old checklist because the SBA agreed with you after many of us also agreed with you very loudly to the SBA. So the audited financial is no longer a prerequisite for application. That if you get more than $750,000, there's some stuff there, but that's on the back end. And
that's only $750,000 of federal money.
Of federal money, yes. So don't worry about those audited financials. That is no longer a requirement.
And that is pointed out in the FAQ. It is still not pointed out in a few other documents, but just know that this has been fixed. People like Nate and I, we monitor the SBA's website 2 to 3 times a day, including weekends. And we caught that auditing requirement. And I had a letter to the SBA administrator in 20 minutes complaining about that, and others too. And so I'm glad that got corrected so quickly. This is an issue about what's counted in revenue. Will restricted or temporarily restricted contributed revenue count as quote unquote revenue, which they're defining as gross revenue at the SBA?
I believe, and I'm trying to remember where this was addressed specifically, but I believe it will count in that restricted revenue that comes in that time would count as revenue if it's received within the period you're looking at, i.e. 2020 or 2019. Is that your estimation, Nina, as well?
Yes, and I'm just gonna add a little bit to that to say that this is an area that we're challenging still. because restricted revenue can't be used to pay for all your payroll of your staff. It's restricted to a very specific purpose. So we're trying to make the point with the SBA that perhaps that should be exempted from the definition of revenue. So to answer your question today on March 18th, it is included as one of the things you have to include in loss of revenue as to whether you fit into those priority categories. But keep staying tuned with what is happening. Things change on an hourly and daily basis at the Shuttered Venues program at the SBA. And so when we finally get those final guidelines, we'll let you know. But we are on your side in fighting that they not be included. Okay. The SVO grant application indicates that we need to submit some proof of lighting rig, soundboard, etc., by submitting receipts for these items or insurance coverage. Since they are not the venue owners and operators, they're performing there. It says, since we don't own the venue, we only perform in it, we don't have these items. What can we do to fulfill that requirement?
I think a lot of that we're going to have to see once the application opens. I mean, there's a lot we still don't know, and you might have a better answer for that specific question than I do. I think
what I read was that I do think I do,
Okay.
and that is that if you're the venue operator, I believe,
right.
you have to show that proof. Otherwise, if you are performing at those kind of venues, you just have to, as I understand it, indicate the names of the locations that you perform at to say that they have that. As I understand it, but it could change. All the details are in the devil, and the devil lies in the application form, and the application form is not available yet.
And and one thing that I noticed that there's no answer for yet is that there's some overlap in what they would call a live performance venue promoter and or a theatrical producer or a performing arts organization. So you got to we don't know, have to figure out which one of those that you are. But if you are an opera company, you would probably define yourself as a performing arts organization. You're going to have to find what suits best for you. But again, we simply we haven't seen the application yet, so we don't know.
Yeah. This one is asking that they are an S corporation sole proprietor for over 30 years now, who's as a sole proprietor, they are the president owner as well, and they have some part-time employees who work less than 10 hours a week. And they're asking, are they still eligible for an SVOG grant? And I think there's a mix-up of what they think about needing a certain number of FTEs.
So my answer is that yes, you are still eligible, and I have not seen anything that specifically says that you have to hire a minimum number of one employee in order to be eligible. You have to pay performers and meet all those other qualifications, but you don't have to have a qualified full-time employee to be eligible for the grant.
Right. And so what I would just add to that is having W-2 employees is not a prerequisite of having a shuttered venue grant. The only time employees and counting your employees makes a difference is if you are trying to get in on the set aside money for small employers, which has to be 50 or fewer full-time equivalent employees. There's no other time that they really ask for employment. So that's number one. And number two is count yourself as an employee, as the sole owner. Count yourself as an employee. So you at minimum have that covered for yourself. The next question, actually, I'm going to insert this question before I get to the pre-written one, is a little bit better understanding on when the money for the set aside for small businesses is administered during the priority periods.
So in my understanding, the reading of how the SBA has phrased this is that if you are if you qualify for priority one and receive your check, if you have less than 50 employees, then that will count against their set aside for 50 or less employees, that $2 billion. Your money would come out of that $2 billion. And then the same with priority two, there'd be 2 billion, it would come out of that $2 billion. Is that anybody in any of the priority periods, as you're receiving your money with 50 or fewer employees, their funding would come out of that set aside. So they have been talking about at least, and that SBA reserves the right to, in keeping with the legislation, to increase that. And I think they're leaning into making sure that that they do, because an obvious point of the legislation was to take care of those smaller entities. Does that sound about right to you, Nina?
Well, this is going to give you an example of the complications of the SBA, and that there is definitely a different reading of that. And the SBA has been known to state one thing and reverse themselves. And this might be one of those areas, because the legislation, and many people believe that the legislation was written to interpret it that $2 billion was a true set aside for the smallest businesses that only had a 25% revenue loss, not the 90% revenue loss. And that this is just for the smallest employers with at least a 25% loss. And I know where you are getting your interpretation from. The SBA has put in an FAQ stating it that way, but we've also challenged that interpretation. So on the books, as it stands now, it's the way you're interpreting it, but the law was not written that way. And so it's a question mark as to whether it will stay that way. So this is a real gray area. It causes a lot of consternation for a lot of groups. Some of the groups that lobbied for this are under opposite interpretation even than what Nate just described. But
Absolutely.
what Nate did describe is what the SBA is currently saying. And welcome to our world.
If you don't like the guidance, wait a few minutes. I did see one question I know I can answer super quickly. Drive-in movie theaters do not qualify as theaters. Because they specifically ruled them out because the movie theater does not, obviously it's a pretty mobile seating unit if it's attached to an engine and you can drive it away. So that is definitely considered non-fixed seating. And as a movie theater, a drive-in movie theater does not count.
Great. What is the status of how city governments can apply for a shuttered venue if they own and operate the performing arts venue or movie theater? And I guess the scenario when they own it but don't operate it.
So to the best of my understanding, a city government is going to be eligible, as I said before, even if that city government gets more than 10% of their funding from the federal government, because basically every city government and every state government and every public university gets more than 10% of their funding. So they said that since they were specifically listed in the legislation, that Congress intended them to be included. However, you would the entity that is owned and operated would then act as its own entity. So you wouldn't necessarily fill out paperwork as if you were the entire city government, but only that portion that is running the Performing Arts Center.
Okay. In regards to the shuttered venue, the SBA Form 480 says, what is a licensee? And can most of, and I guess they're saying it's in regard to shuttered venue. Do you know what they're referring to?
I don't.
Okay. And then this is a question that overlaps with SVOG and what I was talking about earlier in the program about pandemic unemployment assistance. This question is yours, Jody, and it says, double checking. Does PUA does not count as business income? That's correct. And does not affect your PPP2 application. And the reason is because your unemployment money is ordinary income, and your PPP2 application asks you for your Schedule C revenue, gross revenue. Because you do not put your unemployment funds on your Schedule C as revenue, you put it on the front page of your 1040 as ordinary income, it will not be listed as gross revenue on your business account, which is what you would use as a Schedule C to apply for a business loan from the Small Business Administration. And so I think you heard it right, that you do not count your pandemic unemployment money as revenue on your PPP application. And then it says, does PUA or PP1 or your payroll protection loan count as business income in shuttered venue operating grant? And the answer there is also no, it does not count. The Congress did not want to hold that against you. So you do not count as revenue. So therefore, it makes your revenue loss look bigger, which is a good thing for shuttered venues in terms of getting in the priority period. You do not have to count the replacement revenue that you received through either pandemic unemployment or PPP as part of any kind of revenue that you received on your SVOG application. Okay, moving on. Would, Nate, SVOG funds be allowable for the repair of the roof on a storage facility?
I would say yes, because maintenance is specifically listed as an allowable fund, an allowable expense. As long as you spent the money on that maintenance between March 1 of this year and the end of the year, December 31, 2021.
So I think there's an important word in here too when you answer that, and that is storage facility. Does that mean, is your answer still yes if for some reason, what if the storage facility isn't in any way connected to the performing arts facility?
Right.
By venue.
I would say that if the storage, I would think, and this is me speculating, that if the storage facility was directly tied to the operating of the venue, then possibly. But if the storage, if it was if it was not directly tied, then it probably would not count.
Mm-hmm. There is a question about what period you look at for gross revenue, depending on whether you're talking about priority period eligibility or the amount of your award. Could you review that again?
Sure. So to determine first and second priority, they will look at your gross revenue, so everything between April 1st of 2020 and December 31st of 2020, and whether or not you've had a 90 or 70% loss as compared to the same April through December of 2019. And then the third priority, or just general eligibility, is based on earned revenue only loss of 25% in a single calendar quarter, not 3 calendar quarters like first and second priority. Again, we haven't seen the application, so we don't know how that question will be asked. But I think you certainly would want to, possibly, if you think that you might want to know, what is my gross revenue between April 1st and December 31st, regardless of whether or not you think that you're going to fall into first and second priority, because they might ask you that question to determine it themselves. And then you should definitely know what is the quarter, or that is the single quarter where you have between 19 and 20, where you have the greatest loss. And then that would probably be the quarter that you're using to qualify for third priority of earned revenue specifically.
And what I have recommended to people to just get themselves ready while we wait for these detailed application guidelines is to create a monthly matrix of your revenue. One is gross revenue, one is earned revenue, on a monthly basis, so that you can mix and match it for the variety of things that they're going to ask you. One is based on you know, the amount of the possible award. One is going to be which quarter of the particular year that had the loss that they're looking for. And then another one is on a whole percentage of your fiscal year. I think if you do it month by month, and then it'll be easier for you to match up what they're asking for that way. Okay, another question is, will municipal museums who do not charge admission, however they operate classes and they rent their facilities to raise funds, might they be able to apply for an SVOG grant?
Yes. So a museum is not required in any way to be eligible to charge admission. So you would qualify, but you will only qualify for up for 45% of your earned revenue, which would be, you know, tuition for classes, as well as what was the other thing besides the classes?
They charge rent for people to
Right.
rent their
And
facility.
so, and rent would be is considered earned revenue because it is a goods or service. So you're giving someone use of your space for money that is earned revenue.
Now, what about art schools like dance schools that do not charge tickets for people to come to their facility, but they charge tuition for people to come to their facility? And then say they have the occasional recitals where they're not charging a fee either.
So I have a daughter who's a dancer, and I actually worked in ballet for a long time. So I've been mulling this one over. I don't have a perfect answer, you know, because there is that requirement that we saw for performing arts organizations that 70% of your revenue has to come from performing arts, earned revenue from live performance. And arguably, tuition would not be from live performance. That's tuition that's being paid from class. But I personally would advise anyone in that situation to fill out the application and allow SBA to make that determination.
That's going to be the theme for SVOG. Don't disqualify yourself.
Right.
Let SBA do it.
Yeah, I come up with two. I'm moving through my football metaphors when it was deciding between SVOG and PPP before you could do both. I was saying that it was a 4th and goal situation, and you had to decide whether or not to go for the touchdown or the field goal. Now that situation has been revolved, it's like when in doubt, punt. When in doubt, apply. Just apply, because the absolute worst thing that can happen to you if you apply is that you're not eligible.
Yeah. This goes to the question that I've seen both on Facebook Live, questions submitted in advance, and today on the Q&A, and that is, what is the point of applying for a second draw PPP if it's just going to be deducted from your shuttered venue grant?
So the PPP loan process is set up. It's fast. It is very clear. You don't have to define all of these things. You know, everybody, as long as you can show a 25% loss in a single quarter between 19 to 20, you are eligible. Many banks all across the country are set up and ready to do this. They've been doing PPP since last May. So you can apply for that pretty quickly, and you can get the cash in the bank tomorrow. The SVOG is a new grant program. As we have discussed, the SBA is trying to figure this out and shift it. The funds may run out. So the point is to go ahead and apply for the PPP, get those dollars into your bank account, particularly since until Congress fixes it, hopefully next week, your window for getting a PPP completely closes at the end of March. And then the application for SVOG opens in early April. So you want to be absolutely sure that you get the PPP now and then apply for the SVOG so that your net ends up being the same, but that you're sure that you don't miss out on funding altogether if for some reason you don't get the SVOG.
Right. And that's what it really comes down to. A PPP is your closest thing to a sure bet. Whereas the SVOG is competitive, we are in a territory where we do not have solid ground on definitions of how it's going to work. And they are prioritizing those with the greatest losses first. And the money might run out, quite frankly, after that's done, because the size of the grants are enormous, up to $10 million. So that's the reason why we fought to have you have the ability to have both, is because you're going to get the sure bet and you're going to take a risk on the SVOG, but it's not too big of a risk because you didn't forego getting a PPP while you waited for the bigger grand prize of the shuttered venue.
And you're also doing your part to help yourself and everybody else, because there's plenty of money in the PPP program. So the more people that get their money out of the PPP program, that's less of a strain that you're putting on the 16.25 billion in the SVOG program, which is going to help it serve more people and last longer. So so there's a self-serving to that too, is that you actually help the entire field by getting the PPP first.
And this might be our last question. I want to let everyone know that, again, probably within the next 2, at the most 3 weeks, we're going to have a standalone shuttered venue webinar, and I'm going to make sure we have enough time on it. So I'm going to wrap up with this question. Just know there are a few other resources for you. One is that I conduct Zoom office hours every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And you can find that on the Arts Action Fund website, and it's just been posted. So tomorrow at 11 a.m. I will continue answering questions. Number 2, this PowerPoint is posted on our ArtsU resources and on the Arts Action Fund homepage. Number 3, I just posted something hot off the presses from a law firm that we work with, Proskauer, that did an enormous deep dive into shuttered venues, cross-analyzing all of the changes that SBA has been making along the way and where we end up with. Very deep dive into that. And then 4th, we have another webinar coming on shuttered venues. So I'm going to end with this question for you, Nate. Some people are still confused on the 10% federal rule of how that you can only have a maximum of 10%. And they're saying, does it disqualify us because 1, we got some state and local block grant CARES money that was from the federal government, and 2, because we got PPP money for our company that would yield more than 10% of our total revenue.
Right. So any CARES Act money or any other funding from the economic relief bill on the 27th, all of that pandemic federal money does not count towards any calculation dealing with the SVOG. So that does not disqualify you. Your federal pandemic relief money does not disqualify you in any way, because they don't want to disqualify you for this relief because you took advantage of other relief. That was not what Congress intended.
Good. So I wanted to end with that nice note. So as you can see with the slide that's up right now, these are a whole bunch of resources. The office hours is the next to the last one. And I didn't, because it was so hot off the presses, that Proskauer deep dive one is not even listed here, but if you go to our website, you will find it there. Okay, that is a wrap for today. We had a lot of people stay on. Marissa, I'm going to hand it over to you, and publicly, I want to thank you, Nate, for your incredible public service to not only North Carolinians, but to the entire country, for the knowledge that you've built up on this topic.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nate. And thank you so much, all of our panelists and everyone that attended and participated in today's activity, the American Rescue Plan and the Arts. A reminder that this event was recorded and will be available for replay immediately following the session on the Arts Action Fund Facebook page and in 1 to 2 business days on ArtsU. You can visit us at artsu.americansforthearts.org for other training opportunities and resources. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.